Ya, jinglenya diputar sekali ya Mbak ya. Oke.
Okay. Good luck, guys.
Recording in progress.
Mas Didin sudah siap?
Halo Mas Didin, untuk videonya bisa diplay sekarang ya.
Roots. Biennale Jogja 16, 2021. Indonesia with Oceania.
Selamat malam, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Terima kasih saya ucapkan kepada teman-teman yang sudah menyempatkan waktunya untuk turut bergabung dalam pertemuan Zoom malam ini. Saat ini Anda semua sedang menyimak acara Sesi Viral 1. Saya, Mansur Zikri, bersama Alia Swastika, Direktur Yayasan Biennale Jogja Jakarta, akan menemani sekaligus memandu acara ini hingga selesai. Diskusi ini diselenggarakan menggunakan 3 bahasa, bahasa Indonesia, bahasa Inggris, dan bahasa isyarat. Interpretasi bahasa isyarat dilakukan oleh teman-teman dari komunitas Bawayang. Bagi Anda yang ingin mengubah audio sesuai bahasa yang ingin didengarkan, silakan klik fitur interpretasi di bagian bawah layar Anda masing-masing. Di situ terdapat tombol bertuliskan interpretation. Sesi viral merupakan bagian dari program diskusi publik Biennale Jogja ke-16, Ekuator 6, Indonesia bersama Oceania. Program Sesi Viral secara khusus diadakan setiap bulan, mulai dari bulan Agustus hingga bulan November tahun 2021, difokuskan untuk audiens global dan mengundang para pembicara ahli seperti akademisi, peneliti, kurator, seniman, dan pelaku kebudayaan lainnya, terutama yang mempunyai ketertarikan khusus terhadap tema pasca kolonial dan dekolonial. Acara ini terselenggara atas dukungan Yayasan Biennale Yogyakarta, Taman Budaya Yogyakarta, Dinas Kebudayaan Daerah Istimewa Yogyakarta, Kemenparekraf, dan Putih Institute. Malam ini, tema diskusi Sesi Viral 1 adalah Representation and Othering, atau representasi dan pelianan. Topik diskusi ini bermaksud membingkai berbagai perspektif untuk memahami jalinan praktik antara budaya kontemporer yang berkembang di Kepulauan Nusantara dan Pasifik. Diskusi ini juga menekankan bagaimana budaya kontemporer dan budaya lokal saling berhubungan dalam beragam pameran global. Penjelasan ini nantinya diharapkan dapat memberikan pendapat kritis terhadap sistem negara, strategi lembaga sosial dan budaya non-pemerintah, serta reaksi masyarakat dalam menanggapi pertemuan budaya ini, terutama sistem di mana hubungan kekuasaan telah mengalami pergeseran sejarah sepanjang zaman. Untuk mendalami topik tersebut, bersama kita sudah hadir 2 orang pembicara utama, yaitu Rout Tanudirjo dan Kosmin Kostinas, serta seorang penanggap, yaitu Mele Yamomo. Pembicara pertama, Rout Tanudirjo, adalah dosen manajemen sumber daya arkeologi dan budaya di Departemen Arkeologi Universitas Gadjah Mada, Indonesia. Minat penelitian utamanya adalah perkembangan dan pengaruh pemikiran arkeologi terhadap komunitas, atau yang biasa disebut arkeologi publik, dan arkeologi Austronesia. Ia banyak melakukan penelitian arkeologi, terutama di Kepulauan Indonesia bagian timur, dan sering berpartisipasi dalam sesi UNESCO, Asian Europe Meeting, dan ASEAN, membahas hal-hal tentang kebudayaan dan warisan budaya. Beliau pernah menjadi anggota National Heritage Advisory Board Indonesia dari tahun 2015 sampai 2017 dan technical expert dalam delegasi Indonesia di World Heritage Committee UNESCO tahun 2016 sampai 2019. Dia telah menerbitkan banyak penelitian ilmiah yang berkaitan dengan disiplin arkeologi. Nanti Pak Daud akan bercerita tentang pengalamannya mengelola pameran Ancestor and Society di Europelia pada tahun 2017. Pembicara kedua, Kosmin Kostinas, adalah seorang penulis, kritikus seni, dan kurator. Ia menjabat sebagai direktur eksekutif dan kurator di Parasite Hong Kong sejak 2011, dan direktur artistik Kathmandu Triennale tahun 2020. Ia juga merupakan kurator tamu di Dakar Biennale 2018 dan kurator untuk Dhaka Art Summit ke-18 tahun 2018. Dia juga ko-kurator Shanghai Biennale ke-10 tahun 2014, kurator BAK Utrecht tahun 2008 sampai 2011, dan ko-kurator First Ural Industrial Biennale Ekaterinburg tahun 2010. Ia juga editor utama Documenta 12 Magazine, Documenta 12 Castle tahun 2005 sampai 2007. Nanti Kosmin akan berbagi cerita tentang pengalamannya menyelenggarakan pameran koala, women, art, and ethnology. Selanjutnya, pembicara ketiga selaku penangkap diskusi ini, yaitu Mele Yamomo, adalah seorang peneliti dan pegiat teater serta komposer. Dia baru-baru ini mengerjakan proyek Echoing Europe dan Sonus, The Sound Within Us. Keduanya menjadi repertoar di Teater Bauhaus Neunenstrasse. Tahun 2021 sampai 2022, ia menjadi kurator untuk The Colonial Frequency Festival. Ia juga merupakan asisten profesor pada bidang disiplin teater dan studi performance di Universitas Amsterdam. Dia menjalankan proyek penelitian Sonic Entanglement dan juga merupakan salah satu pemimpin proyek Decolonizing Southeast Asian Sounds Archive. Baiklah, Sebelum kita memulai diskusi ini, saya akan mempersilakan rekan saya, alias Swastika, untuk memberikan sepatah dua patah kata sebagai pengantar, terutama untuk memperkenalkan program Biennale Forum, serta memaparkan sejumlah konteks terkait aspek internasionalisme dari Biennale ini sendiri. Kepada Mbak Alia, waktu dan tempat, saya persilakan.
Ya, selamat malam semuanya. Terima kasih sekali atas kehadiran dan atensinya untuk acara Biennale Jogja, sesi viral Biennale Jogja ke-16, Ekuator 6 2021. Sesi viral ini merupakan salah satu bagian dari sesi Biennale Forum yang merupakan program publik Biennale Jogja yang biasanya diselenggarakan sebagai bagian dari program-program untuk produksi dan distribusi pengetahuan. Tahun ini Biennale Jogja Ekuator ke-6 bekerja sama dengan Oceania, sehingga kami melihat menjadi penting untuk membawa gagasan dan kebudayaan Oceania sebagai perspektif dan titik pijak kami dalam pergaulan dunia yang lebih luas. Untuk itu sesi viral ini diselenggarakan sebagai sebuah meeting point, sebagai sebuah platform diskusi bagi mereka yang telah bekerja atau memiliki keterikatan dengan kawasan Oceania, termasuk dalam satu konteks kebudayaan yang diwujudkan dalam praktek-praktek kuratorial dan pameran di tingkatan global. Malam ini kita berdiskusi tentang representasi dan othering dalam konteks dekolonisasi seni. Kami melihat penting untuk membaca kembali pameran-pameran yang telah berlangsung berkaitan dengan kawasan Oceania. Untuk itu kami mengundang Kosmin Kostinas dan Bapak Daud Tanudirjo karena kami melihat pentingnya dua proyek yang telah dilakukan oleh dua kurator tersebut. Kosmin yang telah melakukan pameran tentang kebudayaan Oceania berfokus pada relasi antara seni, gender, dan teknologi, dan bagaimana posisinya sendiri sebagai seorang kurator yang tidak berasal dari Oceania, tetapi melakukan atau membuat praktik pameran Oceania. Pertanyaan-pertanyaan tentang siapakah yang berhak atau siapakah yang dapat berbicara tentang sebuah kawasan atau sebuah kebudayaan menjadi penting diajukan, dan bagaimana dialog yang terjadi antara seorang kurator atau seorang yang bekerja dari sisi luar atau outsider dalam membicarakan atau membahas kawasan ini dan kawasan-kawasan lain yang berkaitan dengan kebudayaan indigenous menjadi sesuatu yang menarik untuk didiskusikan bersama. Sementara dengan Bapak Daud Tanudirjo, seorang arkeolog, kami melihat tidak saja pentingnya perlintasan disiplin di mana arkeologi sebagai bagian dari sebagai background atau latar belakang dari Pak Daud menjadi bagian dari praktek seni kontemporer dan pameran-pameran global. Dalam proyek pameran Europalia tahun 2017, Pak Daud menjadi kurator tamu untuk membawa artefak-artefak Indonesia ke pameran di Belgia, di Eropa, khususnya di Gedung Bozar yang berjudul Ancestor. Bagi kami menarik untuk membandingkan dua perspektif ini antara yang disebut sebagai orang luar dan bagi orang dalam yang merepresentasikan kebudayaannya sendiri dalam konteks global dan internasional, bagaimana gagasan representasi, gagasan othering, atau siapa berbicara untuk siapa, menjadi sesuatu yang saling bersilangan, saling bertemu, saling berdialog, dan kemungkinan-kemungkinan apa yang lahir dari dialog tersebut. Kami sendiri bekerja dengan banyak sekali komunitas yang berada dalam konteks yang berbeda dari seni kontemporer yang selama ini kami lakukan di Jawa atau di Yogyakarta. Misalnya kami bekerja dengan teman-teman di Papua, kami bekerja dengan teman-teman di Kupang, di Ambon, dan pengalaman ini merefleksikan kembali bagaimana definisi tentang seni kontemporer selama ini terkotak dalam satu sistem pengetahuan, terutama yang mengacu pada pengetahuan Barat, yang membuat kita memisahkan hal-hal yang kita sebut sebagai kebudayaan asli atau kebudayaan milik yang dimiliki oleh masyarakat dengan praktek seni yang modern. Pengalaman kami mempersiapkan Biennale Jogja Indonesia dengan Oceania menunjukkan bahwa cara pandang yang bersifat atau mengandung bias kolonial ini perlu untuk diperiksa kembali, dan ini merupakan praktik-praktik yang berbasis pada kritik terhadap apa yang kami lakukan sendiri. Sehingga diskusi ini merupakan satu upaya untuk merentang kembali pengalaman-pengalaman dari beragam pihak yang bekerja dengan kawasan-kawasan Oceania dan kawasan lain, sehingga kami sebagai sebuah institusi dan sebagai pelaku dari Biennale sendiri bisa mendapatkan gambaran yang menarik, yang saling terbuka dan saling memperkaya dalam melihat kawasan-kawasan khatulistiwa yang selama ini menjadi wilayah kerja kami. Semoga malam ini kita bisa berdiskusi dengan dinamis. Kami sangat mengundang pemikiran dan pendapat dari teman-teman untuk dituangkan di sini selain kita mendengar dari 3 pembicara, sehingga ada pertukaran gagasan yang intens yang membawa kami pada catatan-catatan untuk perjalanan kami ke depan. Terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih kepada Mbak Alia atas kata pengantarnya. Sekarang, untuk tidak memperpanjang waktu lagi, kita mulai diskusi ini. Untuk giliran pertama, saya persilakan kepada Bapak Daud Tandudirjo untuk memberikan pemaparannya serta refleksi beliau yang memiliki pengalaman sebagai kurator di Europalia tahun 2017. Kepada Bapak Daud, kami persilakan.
Baik, terima kasih, Mas Sikfi. First of all, I would to thank the committee for the invitation to participate in this forum. Actually, I'm not quite sure if I can meet the expectation of the committee to talk about this topic, representation and othering, as I consider myself not a specialist in the subject. However, I'm quite intrigued and challenged by this interesting topic, so I decided to accept the offer to give a brief talk in this occasion. Hopefully, I could contribute something in this forum, though it is only from my personal reflection or insight. Yeah, I will present my brief talk in more or less 3 parts. Yeah, the first is to provide background information on my encounter, or say my familiarity or my acquaintance with the issue of representation and othering. Yeah, it will give a glimpse picture on my knowledge and experience to address this issue. Yeah, I think it is important to inform this, as once again I'm not an expert in this subject, so everybody can evaluate or weigh, yeah, my personal reflection more proportionally. Yeah, and in the second part, I will tell the story, or it's very short story of my involvement, yeah, in preparing the main exhibition entitled Ancestor and Ritual for the Europalia Indonesian Art Festival in 2017. Finally, I will close my talk with a reflection on the issue as I put them in the frame of wider context, yeah, of the decolonization process. Okay, maybe we can start, yeah, with the first part. Yeah, so initially, I came across the issues of postmodernism, postcolonial, decolonization, and some other related topic in early 1990s. Yeah, when I studied my master at the Australian National University, yeah, through reading some books, yeah, the bestseller book, yeah, such as Edward Said, Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism, something like that. Yeah. And frankly speaking, at the time, I had no particular interest in this topic. I considered those issues just a general knowledge that one should know as a citizen of this globalizing world. However, in the course of my next academic career, yeah, I happened to get closer to these issues indirectly or directly, as I was interested in the history and development of archaeological theory, which in fact influenced by all those issues. Yeah. Unexpectedly, in 1992, I was invited to an important conference of the Theoretical Archaeological Group in Southampton, England. Yeah. During this conference, there was a big debate on the influence of postmodernism in archaeological theory. Yeah. Wait a minute. And later, yeah, because I cannot see my presentation. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, I cannot see my presentation. So
Pak Daud, apakah bisa melihat presentasi Bapak di layar?
ya, itu yang masalahnya saya tidak bisa melihat presentasi itu. Baik. Saya sedang mencoba untuk mencari.
Mungkin pada tim teknis bisa membantu.
Maaf. Okay. I try again. Okay. So yeah, I attended the theoretical archaeology group in Southampton, and there is quite a hot debate about the newly introduced paradigm in archaeology, yeah, which was strongly influenced by critical thinking and postmodern thought. Yeah. The debate impressed me, and I learned a lot from the conference. As I interested in the new paradigm, then I introduced this postmodern archaeology to Indonesian archaeological community in 1996, yeah, to be considered. So, and then during the 1990s, I really enjoy reading the books on the post-colonial Indonesia written by Father Mangunwijaya, a famous Indonesian humanitarian scholar, in which he proposed some very interesting ideas on how to cope with national as well as global problems at the same time. Including in this book, he suggests on how to deal with the nation colonial past. This is very interesting book he written in novels. Yeah, and in 2009, I began to be a co-lecturer in museology at my department at UGM, Department of Archaeology, working collaboratively with staff of the Tropen Museum and museum scholars from the Netherlands for at least the next 5 years. One of the issues that we often discuss was about the museum decolonization in the Western world. Though it was sometimes not quite explicit, however, the discussion have prompted me to read more about the issue. And when in 2013, the Tropen Museum and my department planned to hold an international conference on museology in Yogyakarta, I proposed the main theme, museum of our own, because I'm quite interested on the influence of the colonization movement in Western world into the ASEAN region. Yeah, so I hope that this conference will address the museum decolonization and its relation or its influence to the development of museology in Asia. This theme was attracted a wide interest among experts, and not only Indonesian experts, but also some international scholars, including also cultural institutions in the region, and among others, the positive response was expressed in the website of Siameo Spava, as shown in my presentation. So they mentioned that this is a important point to be considered in the development of ASEAN museology, in general. And in 2015, I was approached to help preparing the main exhibition in the Europalia Indonesia Art Festival to be held in 2017. I think many of you already know about the Europalia. It is quite a prestigious Biennale festival in Europe, and each event, only one country is invited as a guest country to present its various art and cultural aspects in numbers of places in Europe. Though the main exposition is held in Brussels as the center. At that time, I have never thought of becoming the curator of the main exhibition at that festival. However, I was eventually appointed to the task. This is quite a long story. I don't think we need to address this. And I was backed up with a team of scholars from around Indonesia, including anthropologists, sociologists, archaeologists, from Papua, from Maluku, from Kalimantan. I think it's represent all the region in Indonesia. So hopefully our team is quite strong to represent every part of Indonesia and to present it the whole in Europalia. Yeah. So the teams ensure that the content would represent Indonesia correctly in international forum. Yeah. And as I explained formerly, yeah, at the time I was appointed to be the curator of main exhibition. I could say I was overwhelmed, yeah, with the ideas of the museum decolonization movement in the Western world. So this is my background at the time. Yeah. Therefore, I was quite optimistic that Indonesia could be represented from Indonesia's own perspective in the main exhibition of Europalia. I expected that the festival organizer will give us more freedom, yeah, to represent Indonesia in our view. However, yeah, during the preparation of the exhibition, it is evident that my expectation might be too much. Yeah, so I don't feel that the organizer gave the opportunity for us to express, to represent Indonesia in their own perspective. Yeah. So there are some problems that we face during the preparation. Yeah, and later I was informed that in the memorandum of agreement, yeah, signed by the Indonesian government and the organizer, it stated that the selection of the collection to be displayed will be carried out by both parties. In this context, I think this is quite fair still. Yeah, I think so. No problem for us. Yeah. And for the exhibition display, it is also said that it will be fully carried out by the organizer. Yeah, this is quite surprised me at that time. Yeah, to know about this. Yeah, and of course I felt a little bit strange. Yeah, when all the display will be conducted or will be arranged by the host. Yeah, so it is very difficult for us to explain, yeah, or to accept that this will happen. And yeah, because they always said that this is because of the audience. They said that we do not know. Yeah, or they said that we didn't know about the audience in Europe, so they will handle all the exhibition. Yeah, yeah. So and it was then evident that the organizer played a more important role in determining what and how Indonesia will be represented. Yeah, in the main exhibition, including choose the main theme. So they decided the main theme, that is the ancestor and ritual. Yeah. And during the discussion to determine the detail of the exhibition content, there were often heated debate, yeah, between the team, yeah, and the expert who advised the organizer. Yeah. For example, yeah, Indonesian team would like to present more about the Austronesian migration to give historic background of the formation of Indonesian nation, which is a fundamental for Indonesia and to the world to know, yeah, about the formation of Indonesian nation now. Yeah, but and we consider that the Austronesian people is the real ancestor of most of Indonesian people. But finally, they decided not to accept this. So we are very disappointed about that. Yeah. Yeah. So another exciting debate was about the concept, role, and relationship between ancestor and society, yeah, in Indonesia. Yeah. Certainly, there are differing views between Indonesian and European people on this matter. And yeah, this is a quite difficult situation because in Indonesia alone, yeah, itself, yeah, we all know that there are very concept, yeah, from one ethnic group to another group, yeah, another ethnic group, yeah. There are very different or varied conception about the relation between ancestor and the society, yeah, living society. And we have to explain this to the European audience, of course. And it seemed that the organizer is not quite trust us, or maybe they have quite the different perception about that. So we always debated about that. And at last we have some compromise, which is according to some the scholar, Indonesian scholar, is not quite yeah, what you call it, it's not quite acceptable actually. Yeah, yeah. And also the organizer also appointed a number of experts from Netherlands as counterpart or the curator myself, yeah, and prepare all this exhibition as well as writing the catalog book. Yeah. Fortunately, yeah, still most of them understood Indonesian very well, as they often work collaboratively with Indonesian Museum. Yeah, and I have no problem to work with them. Yeah. However, the atmosphere that was formed gave me the impression that the organizer was worried that Indonesians' representation at the main exhibition would not satisfy the expectation of the audience. Yeah? In other words, they did not quite trust the curator, yeah, for presenting Indonesia as expected by European audience. Yeah. For sure, they trusted European expert more than Indonesian expert. So they have, we have to follow, yeah, the view of European expert. Yeah. For example, when we have to interpret or then to present an artifact, yeah, they usually will consult to European expert and maybe to check, yeah, whether our interpretation is correct or not. Yeah, so I think this is a quite yeah, annoying for me especially, yeah, personally. Yeah, in one case during the installation stage, yeah, I suggested that the display of Pratnya statue was not proper, yeah, because it was too low, and I suggest that it needs a higher support or a pedestal to put it higher so that the statue would appear more elegant. Yeah, but the organizer was reluctant to do so. Yeah, until their European expert give the same advice. Yeah, and maybe you can see from the presentation that the first is the statue is just on the something like display low. Yeah, but after that after we have some dispute about how to present this, yeah, and interfere with the European expert, then they agreed to put the pedestal under the statue. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I should say regrettably that the main exhibition of ancestor and ritual in Europalia was still more European perspective rather than Indonesian own perspective. Yeah. The hope to have the opportunity to be able to represent Indonesia from its own perspective was not materialized. Yeah. I got quite a big or quite a lot negative feedback from my Indonesian fellows, yeah, that they were not satisfied with the representation of Indonesia in the exhibition. They said something like not quite Indonesia. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I quite understand their feeling about this. Yeah, and I have to accept that there are many dissatisfaction in Indonesian side. Yeah. Then when I try to reflect myself, and then I recall colonial exhibition used to be held regularly during colonial era. Yeah, and ask myself, what is the difference then? Yeah, certainly there are many differences. Yeah, as the world condition has changed significantly. Yeah, recently. Yeah. However, from my personal experience, the way of representing the other is still not much different, even during the heyday of the colonization movement in Europe. So to this stage, I started to reflect on issue of the decolonization as a whole. Yeah. Firstly, what is actually happened with this agenda? Yeah. Could decolonization erase all the colonial characteristic, or it is only transformed to a new form which is essentially the same, namely treating the others as if they are not capable to represent themselves, and should follow the desire of the dominant ones. Yeah. Yeah. And secondly, I become quite worried about the decolonization movement, which is now increasingly spread and being rapidly adopted, yeah, especially in the formerly colonized countries. Yeah. Is this movement really necessary for those countries? Yeah. Yeah. For countries that have been the perpetrator of colonialism in the past, the colonization might be justified as something like cleansing the scene. Yeah. Yeah. However, for those colonized, I don't think that the colonization is needed. Yeah. Isn't colonialism we can deny that this is our history, or even has become our identity. So whether we like or not, that's already part of us, part of our history. So it's difficult for us to just wipe it out. Does erasing the traces of colonialism mean a denial to ourselves, of ourselves? So this is all the question that rise in my brain. So I think what we need is just liberating our mind from other new form of colonization. This is our task now. So it should be remembered that the decolonization is so far a Western concept as well. So when we adopt such a concept without much consideration, this will be the same as what happened with Orientalism, I suppose. And up to now, I'm still wondering what is actually happening in this global theater. I don't know. I'm still reflecting on many things. So I think I will stop there, and I hope I can make some my reflection to be considered as well. People who also want to see more critically about the decolonization process. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih kepada Pak Daud atas presentasinya. Sebuah cerita yang cukup mencengangkan ya, bahkan bagi saya juga ketika menyimak presentasi ini begitu ada banyak ketidaksinambungan perspektif dalam penyelenggaraannya. Okay, so now please let me speak in English just to give a brief commentary on Daud's presentation. I think the most significant thing in Daud's reflection is his skepticism about the concept of decolonization itself behind in his presentation before. There was agreement between the organizers and the curator, a native Indonesian, in employing the concept, how to represent the idea of Indonesian culture through the collection that would be displayed at the Europalia. I think this discrepancy was not only happened institutionally, in the sense between Western organizer and local curators from the country concerned, but it was also related to the system canons that overshadows the discourse of international exhibitions. In other words, we're dealing with a very urgent problem. It is about how to find an appropriate negotiation model to solve the disjointed perspective. And the question is, exist or not? In addition, I personally agree with criticism on the concept of decolonization, because this concept is also a concept born from the Western discourse. We need to think and perspective of people who have historically experienced as colonized citizens. I think this is an intriguing point to be explored further, especially the Q&A session. And I hope that another speaker, Cosmin, and the discussor can elaborate on this. And I want to give to Alia a chance to open the mic. Perhaps you also have a brief commentary on Daud's exposure before I invite Cosmin, the second speaker, to present his paper. Please, Alia. Oke, Mbak Alia keluar dari jaringan ya. Okay. So I can continue. Oke, ada kendala teknis dari tim teknis. Kita tunggu sebentar. Mohon maaf atas kendalanya. Baiklah, saya kira giliran Mbak Ali untuk mengomentari bisa kita tunda di sesi pertanyaan. Kita mungkin lanjut saja ke pembicara kedua, Kosmin Kostinas. Untuk waktu dan tempat, saya persilakan kepada Kosmin. Silakan untuk memberikan pemaparannya. Hello, Kosmin. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, should I start?
Okay, yeah.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Okay, let me share my screen first. How don't I see it? Yeah. Can you see it?
Yes.
Good. So thank you so much for your invitation. It's really exciting to be here with you and to be part of the very interesting process of the Jogja Biennale. It's a project that I've admired for many years, and it traveled around the equator in non-hegemonic directions and sort of inventing a new vector of movement and of perspective that is really quite unique and original. And it's a great part to present a project that we worked on in this context. And also thank you to Pak Daud, my previous speaker, and really terrible experience that you've shared. And I've also lived and worked for a few years in the Netherlands, and it all sounds painfully familiar indeed. It's a terrible place, really. Yes, so the exhibition I will talk about is an exhibition called Koloa that was curated by Lady Tuna Kepa, who is a teacher, a knowledge holder on the Tongan customary arts of Koloa, somebody who has dedicated her entire life. She's now in her mid-80s, actually, to the preservation, development, and dissemination of customary arts of Tonga. So you see her in the top left image. Lady Tuna Kaimanufiela Kepa was throughout her career, she was invited on several occasions by museums around the world, mostly colonial museums, mostly museums in capitals of former colonial powers, to serve in various advisory roles for their collections or for their exhibitions. She was, however, never invited to curate an exhibition. So it was always about, providing, serving, delivering knowledge and expertise to projects that were curated and ultimately owned by other people. So it was very important for us, and I will speak about who us is and what our involvement was in this project. But it was very important for us to make sure that this is a project that she is curating, and it's basically her voice in creating this project that was in any way largely based on her work, her research work, and also on her collecting work. Now, I think I don't really need to introduce too much geography. I mean, when I spoke about the project in Europe, I had to, because of course it's very far away from Europe. But still, you know, I'm presenting a map of the Pacific with actually like a very Eurocentric division of territories, a division which is nevertheless used in the Pacific as well in several contexts. Tonga. You see Tonga actually like in the middle of the Pacific or the Western Pacific. The name of Tonga actually means south in most Polynesian languages. And that was largely because for an important, for a long period of time in the development of Pacific civilization, Tonga was the southernmost point of inhabitation of the Great Polynesian civilization. So, as you know, Aotearoa, New Zealand was inhabited much later. So, had Tonga as its southernmost point. And Tonga, the Kingdom of Tonga, is also the only territory in the Pacific that was actually not colonized, was not formally and not effectively a European colony or a Western colony, which gives it quite a different symbolic status, but also in many ways it certainly establishes the difference in terms of how its institutions and how its relationship to its customary structures of both power and cultural representation is set up. So in many ways, yes, it is a state that is not post-colonial and is not decolonial, although this can certainly be discussed very much. But it's a state that basically has this uninterrupted connection to its pre-colonial structures, including its kingdom and various social structures. Alongside this, although not necessarily because of its status as I said earlier, as the only country in the Pacific that was not colonized, Tonga is the part of the Pacific where customary arts have remained the most central to cultural and social life of all Pacific countries. It's also now, it's important to establish terms first. So I think for a lot of people working in the Pacific, terms such as traditional art for practices that essentially derive from a pre-colonial artistic genealogy for artistic practices that are not derived from European forms. So for a majority of practitioners in the region, the term customary is preferred over traditional. There's a debate going on, but I think the main arguments are that traditional implies a certain ahistoricity, a certain quality of being unevolving, of being static, of being fixed in a in a particular moment of development rather than being then changing with the times. And of course, this was like an important component of colonial perspective of regarding the other as perennial, as not changing, as having developed forms that do not function in history, do not exist in history, do not change with the times, in the same way in which art from a Western perspective, changed with history and reflected history. So that's certainly something that, together with a lot of other thinkers in the Pacific, it's something that we did not want to reinforce. So, the choice of the word was one step in this direction. There are also people who believe that, actually the term customary and customary art is equally problematic or also problematic because it also sort of like fixes artistic practices in a in a sense of alterity. So it basically qualifies the word art, and in that way it denies the full capacity of being recognized as art. So, and I will come back to that later, because an important part of our collective effort here was to actually work also at the definition of art in general, and of contemporary art, and how the definition of contemporary art needs to be changed rather than, the definition of artistic practices in various places. Now, what are we really talking about when we're talking about these practices? So the term Koloa itself, so the name of the exhibition, is a term that is often used to describe this practice. It's not the equivalent or the translation of art. It's actually the Tongan, and the word that can also be found in other Polynesian languages for value. So for something that is, both precious in a abstract way, and something that is, a heritage or has the value of patrimony, but at the same time can also be understood from a very pragmatic point of view as something that captures wealth and preserves wealth, something that functions as a collection, as contemporary art is often used for investment, in many circles. So it can also be understood in that way. And concretely, it basically describes several distinct practices. One of them is bark cloth making. So the art of obtaining and making cloth from the bark of trees, making that into a material, and in most of the cases also adorning it, painting it, or writing on top of it to create these objects that in Tongan they're called ngatu. They are more often known in English with the Maori term for bark cloth, which is tapa. It's of course an art form that exists for equal length in Indonesia as well. It's still practiced in Sulawesi, and it's very likely that it was actually an art form that was actually spread with the Austronesian migration. And the tree that is used to obtain the bark cloth differs. So there's different trees used throughout the Pacific, although in most of the places it's actually the mulberry tree, so the same tree that is used to feed the silkworms. And in Tonga, indeed, it is primarily the mulberry tree that is used to to obtain the bark, and genetic research on the mulberry trees have actually in Tonga and in parts of the Pacific have actually traced them to Taiwan, and with the same number of generations as the people's migration from Taiwan. So it is very likely that it was an introduced plant, and it was carried actually like throughout the different places of the Austronesian migration. So that it was actually seen for a very long time as a main form of expression. Together with bark cloth making, there is also the weaving that in the Tongan case is primarily known as a ta'ovala. You see them here on the tables. Let me find a better image. Which is also made from several plants. It can be made from hibiscus. It can be made from pandanus, and actually in Tonga, both of these plants have different subspecies. Some of them are specific to particular villages. There are different techniques of obtaining the fiber from these plants, the different techniques of weaving that results in objects of various levels of quality, and they're also like used in different contexts. Lastly, another sort of artistic form that is part of it are the kafas, and these are these woven belts that are traditionally made from hair. They're made from women's hair. They're also made and exchanged and passed on a generational context. So very often you carry the hair of a close relative. Very often the age of that person is expressed through the color of the kafa, as you can see in the second object from the left here, which is a gray, which is made from the gray hair of a senior woman. So these are the materials. Now, each of them have a very particular function in a Tongan context, and that function is basically that set of functions, because they each actually have like more than one function, but they're still very specific functions, are very much part of the cultural landscape of the country. These are objects that continue to be produced. These are objects that continue to have particular relevance for individual makers, artists. They are objects that also have relevance in terms of storing value. The reason why the exhibition has the name Women in it is because it's primarily women who make these objects. And it's also a way for women to participate in the economy. It's a way for women to produce value, to store value, and to exchange value. So through the conversations that Vivian Sear, who was the colleague with whom we've done the research that sort of like initially brought us in contact with Lady Tunafiela Kepa, it was also important to in the dialogue that we started with Lady Tuna to discuss about how to present this living art forms. And it was also important to know that, we work in the context of a contemporary art institution. And it was crucial for us to do that in that context. It was certainly crucial for us for this not to be an ethnographic project, for this not to be a representational project, one that looks at an overall context. It's not to be a project that claims to be representing an entire country, the country of Tonga. Yeah? And it was also important for these objects to, at the same time, maintain the context that produced them and maintain their ability to speak about the context that produced them, but at the same time to be able to function as art objects in a contemporary art context. And there is a tension in this sort of like double function, but it was very important for us because this is precisely the two ways in which objects from formerly colonized worlds are denied value in a Western context, because on one hand, if you have a sculpture from 19th century Sumba, for example, in a Western context, there's a double denial happening there. I mean, besides the fact that it's very likely that that object was stolen, but leaving that aside for now, on one hand, the context which produced is absent, it's muted. How those objects were actually, why were they produced in the first place? How they function in the society of Sumba, for example, is invisible to the visitors of that museum. But at the second time, they're also denied their full quality as art objects. They are never discussed in the same way as artistic objects from Europe of the 19th century. There is a kind of like, beauty that is assigned from that sort of patronizing colonial gaze, looking at the patina, at the silk of the maker, but they're never discussed in the same context as 19th century European objects. Same with the Benin bronzes, and essentially same with any colonial object. So it was important for us to try to overcome both these sort of like situations, that on one hand, they need to be speaking about the context in which they are made, but at the same time to also function as art objects, also because in their original context, they do function as art objects as well. They are, places of individual expression. They are places of debate and reflection of the times, of historical processes. They are essentially, performing all the work that art normally does. So we did several things for it. I mean, first of all, it was also important for us for the exhibition to not happen in Hong Kong for the first time, like not to be an exhibition that is made for the audience in Hong Kong, even if, of course, Hong Kong is a strange sort of like place in that conversation because it's not a colonial center. I mean, it was itself a colony. It's actually the one of the last colonies to stop being a European colony, but at the same time, it does have that hegemonic power that comes from the wealth that Hong Kong has, and it's sort of like ability to initiate conversations and to be at the forefront of conversation. So, because of that sort of ambiguous status that Hong Kong had, it was important for us not to make the show for Hong Kong, because again, that's a very colonial way of, bringing things somewhere to an imperial center to make it visible for those audiences. So it was important for the exhibition to actually open for the first time in Tonga. So it did in Nuku'alofa at the Longofanua Center. And Longofanua is an institution that was established in the 1950s by Queen Salote, specifically for the purpose of preserving, you see Queen Salote there, but better here, particularly for the purpose of preserving customary arts of Tonga, and also for giving women a place for creation, and also like gathering and a social space. So the exhibition, which Lady Tuna curated, and which we sort of like served as conversants, as people who helped sort of like the process of the show, sort of going to different places, but also as interlocutors of, let's say, coming from that contemporary art perspective. And this was something that Lady Tuna was also like very much interested in, and you know, she was you know, very actively involved in these questions that we had, and that sort of like opposition between an ethnographic museum versus an art space, and what are the differences that occur in between these types of institutions. So you see here the exhibition in Tonga, and then there's images of the exhibition in Hong Kong. So there are several things that are important to say. So that kind of no, maybe let me mention this first. Sorry. Now, besides the fact that these objects are being made today and that they're stored and preserved, their function and the role that they play in a very complex exchange economy that extends in many parts of the Pacific, you know, with particularly ngatus being gifted at different ceremonies, and you know, sort of re-gifted as well in different contexts. So really functioning almost as a currency of value means that, particularly in a Tongan context, a large number of families, even without a particular significant social standing, would actually have their own collections of objects from throughout the Pacific. So they would have bar cloth and weaving that were done contemporary now, but by, you know, women in their family. They would have a few ancient objects in their family. They would have other objects done by other people in their community. Very likely, some objects made by people who are close to them, but also likely some objects by the best makers in Tonga, because they would then be sort of like acquired, and every sort of like family collection would aim and struggle to have some of the best examples. But then almost every family would have objects from throughout the Pacific. So basically, through this sort of like set of exchanges, almost every Tongan family would have a few masis, which are the bar cloth from Fiji, and you see one here in the right-hand image, and some weavings from Samoa, which is actually even better known for its weavings, and, you know, possibly various objects from Tahiti, and so on and so forth. And this is crucial, and this was actually an important part of the show, that basically what you have here is not just objects that are the analogous and the equivalents of art making, and you don't have contemporaneous artistic practices only that we try to show at the same time, but you also have an indigenous language of collecting, an indigenous language of essentially displaying things together and an indigenous logics of accumulating things in the same place. And it was crucial to show that, because it wasn't anymore about trying to find a way to show these objects in the format of an exhibition or an institution, which is, obviously has a history and it's connected to a certain like Western history of institutions, but it was about acknowledging the existence of a particular logic of bringing these things together, So it's not anymore about objects being brought together in the context of an exhibition because, that's somehow connected to and a tradition of 300 years of Europe of sort of like representing the colonized space in their own metropolitan capitals through the objects amassed and looted from those places together. But then there's, another perspective of not just of the objects, but of their presence in the same place together, that the actual logics of an exhibition together can be derived from this tradition of essentially a family collecting in the Pacific. So the way in which we showed the objects were, again, part of this double logic. On one hand, to be, reproducing the ways in which these objects are shown in a Tongan context, but to try to see to what extent they can be decontextualized and treated as objects. Also, to just make a connection to what my previous speaker has said, that's possible because unlike those statues, these objects are, of course, very valuable, but they're not sacred in the same way. So there is a certain degree of flexibility that is always allowed in this context, because some of this bark cloth can be worn, some of them can be displayed. Most of the time it's displayed as we did it on tables, but in certain occasions they can be also like shown vertically. In some very special occasions they can be laid on the floor. People of certain prestige can walk on them and so on and so forth. So for the exhibition itself, we also had this table, which you see here, which is primarily with objects from across the Pacific, which was indeed trying to contextualize the sort of like conversation on Koloa, on the Tongan customary arts through, presenting other objects from across the region, but again, doing it in that logic of a family collection. But it was also important for us to insert a couple of objects that would have actually not be visible in most Tongan family collections, because we also wanted to avoid transforming the collection itself, the indigenous Tongan collecting itself, into an ethnographic object. So we didn't want that to become, that object of alterity, of otherness, as something that is displayed as it is, as you can find in Tonga. So we wanted to have that as a method, but not as fake claim of authenticity. And in order to deal with that, we actually tried to see how we can introduce that sort of like subjective component of contemporary art curating, of associating objects because of their social function, formal connection, but without that kind of like ethnographic need for things to be connected in a kind of culturalist way. So in this sort of like fun curatorial brainstorming together with Lady Tuna and with Vivian, we actually included a couple of other objects from other parts of the world that were connected formally or in terms of their history history in terms of their having analogous histories, but not having the same sort of like, sense of belonging to the same cultural space as an ethnographic context would demand. So we had a few objects from Ghana and from Japan and so on and so forth on this table, so trying to have this sort of different methods working together at the same time.
Sorry, Cosmin, interrupt.
I'm basically done. Yeah. I mean, just wanted to say that we also showed 3 women artists from the Pacific, contemporary artists from the Pacific, that and it was also important, when we display them together, to also bring into question how does authorship, how is it recognized, in between contexts that are normally relegated to craft and contexts that are normally acknowledged to be contemporary art making. So the fact that the author and essentially the artist behind objects has a very different status depending on the provenance of the object, what kind of space of what that we assign to their, so depending on from which context they actually derive, whether it's a context that through a colonial perspective we're relegated as craft, obviously there's very often the author remains less acknowledged. There would be a lot of things to say, but there's no time. We also had this amazing program with an indigenous navigator from Samoa who is using celestial mapping in order to retrace the roots of Austronesian navigation, and that's also derived from the work of contemporary bar cloth maker from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Nikau Hindin, which you can see here. But yeah, I think this is it. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih Cosmin atas presentasinya. Sedikit memberikan tanggapan terhadap presentasi Cosmin. Jika kita merujuk kembali pada pemaparan yang di awal tentang tujuan dari penyelenggaraan pameran tersebut, yaitu salah satunya adalah meredefinisi kembali pengertian dari seni kontemporer. Saya kira ada aspek yang menarik tentang bagaimana objek-objek masyarakat Tonga itu dipresentasikan di dalam pameran, yaitu bukan hanya sebagai objek seni, tetapi juga mengandung semacam logika indigenous dalam konteks how to display things. Dan saya kira ini berkaitan dengan pemaparan Pak Daud sebelumnya tentang politik display, yang mana akan muncul pertanyaan kemudian bagaimana politik display itu dikemas sehingga bisa memberikan semacam tawaran pemikiran baru, bahkan mungkin terhadap dekonstruksi terhadap pemikiran dekolonial itu sendiri. Oke, sebelum saya mempersilakan Melia Momo untuk menanggapi presentasi kedua pembicara utama kita, mungkin Mbak Alia ingin memberikan tanggapan sedikit sebelum ke Mele. Silakan Mbak Alia.
Yeah, thank you very much for Pak Daud and also Cosmin for those very interesting presentations. I think it's very important for us here to somehow engage into this kind of conversation. Sorry, my video doesn't work. So I think from two speakers, we can underline the two important concepts that need to be explored further. The first one, when Cosmin and Pak Daud equally mentioned the location of the exhibition, we talk about the politics of location. I think both of the speakers, they agreed that it is important to look into the context where the exhibition happened. So Cosmin mentioned that it is important for the team to do the exhibition not the first time in Hong Kong, but in the hometown of the artifact itself to be appreciated and displayed in front of the people and the community. While in Pak Daud case, it's quite different because then the artifacts move and they transform into different location with different exhibition forms. And then the second one is the point from Cosmin about subjectivity. I think it's very interesting that as a curator, Cosmin points out that his involvement and also connection with those people shaping his subjective perspective on how you call Oceanian and Pacific culture. So it's very different context with the exhibition of Europalia, where the team somehow expected Pak Daud and other curatorial teams to represent the idea of country. So there is, in a way, expectation to be more objective there and also to be more distant. I think it's very important, the story of intimacy and the personal narratives behind the artifacts that being displayed by Cosmin. And I think this kind of personal stories was somehow reduced in the context of display when we heard the story from Pak Daud. I think those case, the exhibition by Cosmin and also in the Europalia is very interesting case for us to be discuss all these two important things. And also I underline the last questions thrown by Pak Daud in his presentation of decoloniality. I think we can discuss more and we can hear more from Mele. So I think also I would like to invite Mele to be on the floor and give us responses from what we heard from Cosmin and Pak Daud. So please, Mele.
Amalia, thank you for that. I'd also like to first and foremost thank you, the organizers, Amalia and Anshur, for this invitation. I also echo what Cosmin earlier said, that that praise needs to be given to the Yogyakarta Biennale for providing a space, a curatorial project that that allows us to think and imagine beyond the hegemonic approaches of these global international biennales. And I also appreciate hearing the presentations of the two experts who preceded me, working already within the region and working in Southeast Asia and also Oceania. My response is probably it's a little bit more perhaps tangential, in a sense that my own reflection comes from my own field, which is performance and sound studies. But I want to maybe piece together some of the thoughts. My notes are a little bit old. I've been taking notes here and there, so it's probably not as immediately coherent. So I will just try and present some of these thoughts. But indeed, one very interesting thing that comes across is the colonial ghost, particularly of the Netherlands, that seems to tie all three of us here. I am at the moment, I'm teaching at the University of Amsterdam, wherein 5 years ago, when I tried to organize a conference about Southeast Asia, I was told that my project is extremely exotic, even for the city of Amsterdam. Interestingly, despite the Netherlands connection with and its imperial connection with Southeast Asia. Perhaps something that also made me think about in listening to the two presentations is my own journey. As somebody who grew up in Southeast Asia. I was born in the Philippines. I did my bachelor's in the Philippines, and I came to the Netherlands to do my master's, and I did my PhD in Germany, and I now hold an assistant professorship at the University of Amsterdam. I stand between, these multiple positionalities, and see these multiple perspectives that really unveil a lot of the epistemological violence of colonialism in our own thinking. I'd like to kind of remember. I'd like to start a little bit by thinking about how the shift also transpired in me. I was doing my PhD in Munich at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität, and it was a 4-year PhD, and I was doing my archival work. So I was writing about 19th century music and performance cultures in Southeast Asia, and I've been traveling and doing archival work all over Southeast Asia, but also Europe. And halfway through my own dissertation writing, I realized something that I wasn't very convinced about what I was writing about. If I would have kept going with the way that I was writing, I've already written 3 chapters out of 7 that I was planning to write back then. I could have finished my PhD in 2 years. But I realized that part of the reason why it would have been that easy is because there was already a narrative set, and all I needed to do was bring my case studies from Southeast Asia and put them into this narrative that has been set in front of me. And I realized this was not what I wanted to do. I do not want to put a footnote to music and theater history, which has already been defined what it was. And therefore, all I would ever be doing is just adding a footnote that, oh, well, this also happened in Southeast Asia. And this forced in me this epistemological shift in my own thinking. And this is the reason why I moved from my own previous scholarship and also artistic practice as a theater maker and a sound and music composer, and really abandoned this discipline towards performance and sound in my attempt to decolonize that space, where I want to leave that discourse where I am only intended to bring subjects that would be either legitimized or delegitimized by this discipline, but rather bring the discourse to my side of the court and say that there are different sound cultures and different performance cultures, and theater and music are just one of those that are among the multiple different performance and sound cultures. And this was my way to leave this very vertical way of looking at material culture, and therefore, and for that matter, understandings in how certain practices, cultural practices, are already being put in certain hierarchies, and therefore sometimes when we enter this space, because these system pre-exist before we're even born. These are centuries old colonial system that has already set this hierarchy, and sometimes we become, we place certain roles in scripts in this very performative performance studies way of looking at things, in how in how we are moving within these categories. And to me, my decolonial strategy is to create a horizontal space in which and to think about sound as a process of listening, and therefore, and one of them is among them is music, and that is not necessarily the framework that I intend to allow my own cultural research to be to define, to become the definition through which my own work will go through. I mentioned this because I think what became important to me was, rather than the question of what is theater, what is music, what do we add to this when we think about Southeast Asia, the shift towards performance and sound studies also allowed me to change the question of to whom are we representing, and therefore when we think of other, for who is the other and what is this other? So to go back to this theme of the panel today, I I'd like to problematize this indeed question, because we see here two specific examples of how we navigate through these very complicated issues of of representation, and therefore who represents and what is being represented and for whom is being represented, and therefore what is the other, like who is the other for who. Now, who in thinking about this other, because we already know that in the long history of colonialism, Europe needed to create its other to be able to construct the self, which is the European self, in order so that it could build an empire built on the idea that something needs to be conquered. And in this wider epistemological matrix and economic logic of neocolonialism in the sense that we do not operate in formal colonialism now, but this continue to persist. There is an imagined self and there is an imagined other. And so while the other serves a political purpose for the justification of the European self, the other has been crystallized and solidified into performative roles that has been embedded in our own cultural repertoires. So that sometimes our role, whether as performers or artists or curators, is that sometimes we are curating these repertoires, these behaviors in which, I when I say repertoire here, I think of it in the way that Diana Taylor talks about archives and repertoires, that we do have archives like this collection of materials that tells about a history, but history can also be seen in our performative repertoire, the way that we speak, the way that we put meanings to sound, the way that we carry our bodies, is all performative repertoire that tells about a very long history. And the danger about this as well is that we could also be performing our own very otherness, and therefore, because these other has already long been defined. I want to cite a little bit in the context of our discussion. I want to cite Walter Mignolo, a decolonial scholar, who thinks about epistemic disobedience. He said that it is often the expectation that if a scholar or artist comes from Latin America or Africa or Southeast Asia, that they have to talk about Latin America or Africa or Southeast Asia. That in such a case, you have to be the token of your own culture. However, such expectation will not arise if the author comes from Germany, France, England, or the Netherlands, or the US. This is rooted in the assumption that the first world has knowledge and the third world has culture. Mignolo further argues that geopolitics of knowledge goes hand in hand with geopolitics of knowing. Who and when, why, and where is knowledge generated? So therefore, asking these questions means to shift the attention from the enunciated to the enunciation. And by so doing, rather than assuming that thinking comes before being, one assumes instead that it is a racially marked body in a geo-historical marked space that feels the urge or get the call to speak, to articulate, in whatever semiotic system, the urge that makes of living organisms human beings. And so therefore, by setting the scenario in terms of geo and body politics, I'm starting and departing from the already familiar notions of situated knowledges. I also reflect on this because in my own work as a scholar and artist of color, born in post-colonial Philippines and now based and situated in the Netherlands and Germany, I come to the question, how can I avoid the representative of my own culture? How can we transcend this social script embedded within the colonial logic? Like Pak Daoud's experience when he first encountered post-colonial theory, the need to answer my decolonial question did not come as obvious necessity, nor did it come with urgency to me. We probably now have tools from critical theory to understand that my inability to feel the urgency of the decolonial work was based on my own privilege as someone who benefits from the social and cultural capital of my Europeanized education. But as a post-migrant scholar and artist who moved to Europe, I became aware of the inequality of these privileges. My ability to know my own Southeast Asian, at the same time, and also European cultural history, is a post-colonial and a post-migrant condition. This doesn't operate the other way around. In the classroom, I could talk about Southeast Asia and Europe, but my colleagues could not do the same. But this becomes more complicated. I think there are more issues in which I was pushed to think further about these issues. Maybe I could come back to that in a little bit. Something that I want to bring up now as well in the context of our conversation, and again bringing my own sound reflection into the conversation to complicate the already the very complex actually tapestry of thoughts that we are trying to weave together. I bring Gayatri Spivak's question when she asked, "Can the subaltern speak?" To me, this is a very sonic, this is a very sound studies question, although I don't think it was the initial intention for her. But speaking is a sonic practice, and if we cut through the very dense philosophical reflection of Gayatri Spivak, in the end, her answer is no. The subaltern cannot speak, simply because when we hear them, then they cease to become subaltern. It means that the entire language, or what Mignolo says, the semiotic system, the entire semiotic system that we have now is the language of the empire. And therefore, if we start to speak in the language of the empire, then we cease to become subaltern. We are already speaking as part of the empire. And therefore, the question persists, therefore, that is there a way that subalternity remains, without necessarily entering the space? And I think that for me is an important question. And how can we articulate and speak and resound, not necessarily within the legibility of that global modernity that is, to begin with, a Eurocentric modernity. No? In my research project and in the recent performance piece that I created, I also began to ask, as a post-migrant artist from Southeast Asia operating in Europe, how am I just an anthropologist? How have I become an anthropologist of my own culture? How am I not just a translator of my culture within this, to be translated, into this imperial knowledge? And therefore, I am now at a place to ask, how can I interrupt this colonial script that my European education has embodied in me? At the beginning of my response, I asked for whom is the representation and to whom is something being othered. This is an important question because if we do not ask this question, we are easily replicating the existing script that Pak Daud so incisively articulated for us. Pak Daud's incisive diagnosis of the ghosts of the world colonial exposition as a persistent specter in how it forms our understanding and how it shapes the way we look, the way we listen, and the way we feel. Its logic and its implicit performative dramaturgy informs how we curate material and immaterial cultures. Colonialism is a global project, and the roles it has defined are often already assigned implicitly, and they persist. Even as a formerly colonized, we could be perpetuators, and we might even police the hegemonic system from which we might be benefiting from. Most recently, having received funding from the Berlin Senate for Culture and the Arts to curate a theater and sound art festival entitled The Colonial Frequencies, I have been thinking a lot also about my role and how could I already be complicit to this persistent colonial framework. And something that comes to mind, and to bring this conversation to the now, to these very technologized system in which we occupy now, how am I just being hired as a benevolent hacker? In the Silicon Valley, these big techno companies would hire hackers under their payroll to hack the system. to try to destroy it. But they are under the payroll of these companies. So to ensure that no criticism, no hacking would be able to survive any of these hackers, because even the hackers are under the payroll. And this is a question I'm constantly asking now as, you know, as a scholar, as a curator, as an artist. How am I perhaps now just a hacker, as you know, that criticizes the system, and in so doing actually enabling and empowering this colonial system? So therefore, I'd like to bring this back again in the context of our panel, and I would therefore like to raise the questions: how can we think of curation as a practice in space for claiming that space outside the tokenistic representational expectation within our embodied colonialism? How can we ensure that our enunciations and articulations are not intended for the legibility within Western modernity? Rather, how can we resound voices and positionalities outside the imperial logic of the predetermined universal self and its colonial other? Cosmin's curatorial example provides for us an important model in how we can build on a global South-South conversation in imagining and building new modes of thinking and curating. And we see this also in the example of the Yogyakarta Biennale, and how we could reframe these questions from these specific place. And I think I'd like to leave. I'd like to end this reflection with these questions that I've just enunciated. Thank you very much.
Ya, terima kasih kepada Mele atas tanggapannya. Kita sebenarnya sudah berada di penghujung waktu, tapi kami berupaya untuk tetap mengadakan sesi tanggapan balik dari Pak Daud maupun Kosmin. Mungkin mau memberikan sedikit respon terhadap pertanyaan yang disampaikan oleh Mele di ujung pemaparannya. Mungkin kepada Pak Daud mau menanggapi. Bisa berbahasa Indonesia saja karena kita ada interpreter di sini.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Sikri. Ya, saya kira kalau saya juga sangat tertarik dengan apa yang dilakukan oleh Kosmin ya yang berkaitan dengan pembuatan serat ya untuk barcode ya. Saya kira itu dan cara mengkurasi dengan bekerja sama dengan para pemilik atau pembuatnya dengan situasi yang menghubungkan antara yang modern dengan yang tradisional, itu menurut saya cukup menarik, karena memang kita tidak bisa meletakkan itu sekarang ini dalam kondisi sekarang itu secara terpisah-pisah ya. Dan kemudian kalau mungkin saya ingin merespon pada Mele, saya kira pandangan-pandangan Mele itu sangat-sangat tajam ketika dia melihat dan memposisikan dirinya itu di dalam konteks antara ya. Sekarang ini kan kita sudah agak sulit gitu ya. Kita tidak mungkin tidak terpengaruh gitu ya, yang betul-betul pure itu ya. Jadi ketika kita itu sudah menggunakan bahasa-bahasa yang imperial gitu ya, ya otomatis kita menjadi bagian dari mereka juga. Ya, ketika kita merepresentasikan diri kita di lingkungan mereka, ya ini juga menjadi bagian dari mereka. Ya. Dan itu saya kira tidak akan bisa menjadi suatu yang membuat kita beralasan bahwa kita tidak terrepresentasikan, tapi masalahnya itu adalah bagaimana kita itu bisa dalam kondisi tertentu kita itu melepaskan diri dari pemikiran-pemikiran yang biasa mereka lakukan terhadap kita. Artinya seperti yang saya alami di Europalia, terus terang saja, seakan-akan bahwa kita itu mempresentasikan diri untuk kemegahan orang Eropa sendiri, gitu ya. Artinya apa? Artinya saya melihat bahwa proses dekolonisasi atau mungkin istilah yang lain ya, itu justru ingin menunjukkan bahwa orang Eropa atau Western itu sekarang menjadi lebih mulia dengan menyadari dekolonisasinya, gitu kan. Ya, jadi ini adalah ya bagian dari mereka itu untuk tetap berada di atas, begitu kan. Sehingga kesamaan antara kita dengan mereka ini ya akan tetap saja, gitu kan. Nah, yang saya katakan tadi adalah kekhawatiran saya ya, bahwa dengan adanya katakanlah import ya, konsep dekolonisasi kita tidak hati-hati, yaitu kemudian kita akan melihat kebanggaan baru dengan orang Eropa itu sudah menyadari hal-hal yang baik dan kita harus ikut kita. Nah, inilah yang apakah betul kita sebetulnya membutuhkan ya, kembali ke situ lagi ya. Ya memang saya memahami bagaimana kita harus merepresentasikan, kita harus tahu tempatnya di mana ya, dan kepada siapa kita melihat, gitu kan. Ya, tetapi apakah sama dengan dalam hal konsumerisme ya? Apakah kita itu yang akan didrive oleh kebutuhan konsumen ataukah produsennya yang akan mendrive? Kan begitu. Ya. Nah, seringkali terjadi ya, kalau kita bisa mendrive mereka sehingga mereka membutuhkan kita, nah itu ya sama saja dengan kolonialisme, gitu kan. Nah, itu yang memang kemudian harusnya mereka juga memahami kita dan kita mencoba untuk memahami mereka. Nah, timbal baliknya itulah yang kemudian akan mempertemukan bagaimana kita bisa dalam tanda petik sejajar. Tapi sejajar betul juga mungkin tidak akan mungkin karena kita sudah menggunakan seperti yang dikatakan tadi oleh Mele adalah cara ekspresi mereka, terutama adalah yang bahasa itu. Ya. Bisa bicara atau enggak? Ya kalau kita bicaranya ya bicara menurut mereka, gitu kan. Nah itu, ya saya kira itu saja. Terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih kepada Pak Daud. Mungkin Kosmin, kamu bisa memberikan tanggapan terhadap refleksi baik Pak Daud dan Mele terkait dengan perspektif itu. Kamu masih termute. Sorry, Kosmin, you are still in mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Mele, for the response and thanks, Bagdaud, for the presentation. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier that it's I think really like an exemplary context of like how things are still done in contexts like that in a European context. So I think that's basically an example of the way in which the system works in so many cases that I think like what we tried to do with the exhibition was to in a way to actually respond to that, and in many ways was a way to try not to do exactly those kind of things. And Mele, you mentioned that even in an Amsterdam context, you wanted to organize a Southeast Asian conference, and it was seen as too exotic, and I'm not surprised at all. So I think it sort of like speaks to the same situation. I mean, I think without there's no real time to go into all those details, but I think in a way to really go into the discussion very, very, very deeply. But I think ultimately, what we do and what we should do is to find ways for that sonic experience to actually happen, and I think there are ways and strategies that can be found in the languages and the sonic systems in indigenous contexts that offer us the key to do that. I mean, again, I don't want to be very self-referential here because of the exhibition that I mentioned, but in a way, what was there in that sort of like context that Lady Tuna was working in was precisely a key for bringing in a whole language of exhibition making that is not the imperial language, but one that is also audible, nevertheless. And again, it's not only about voices, disparate voices. It's not about objects. It's not about songs, but it's about a whole language that is audible, and it is not the language of the empire. And like that, there are many other examples. So I think our task in working with these principles in mind, and whether we agree on the semantics, and whether we want to use terms like decolonization or not, or whether we agree on other premises. I think the ethos is shared, and I think the politics behind or the overall sort of like political drive is shared among all the speakers, of course. And so and I think if we subscribe to that, the task is to actually find ways for that speaking to happen, for those languages to be identified and to be brought into the conversation, and for the sort of like structures of the empire to be dismantled in that way. And I think that's ultimately happening. I think that is in the process. I mean, that's not it's still a battle to be had, but it's a battle that is being won. It's in a process of being won. And I think that's something we should never forget, in these efforts.
Oke, mungkin kepada hadirin, apakah ada yang mau melemparkan pertanyaan kepada dua pembicara dan satu penanggap kita? Kita masih menyediakan waktu. Oke, jika tidak, Mbak Alia masih berada di sini? Tidak juga. Oke. Sebenarnya saya masih mempunyai satu pertanyaan yang saya kira ini penting untuk coba dilemparkan, sekedar untuk menawarkan semacam spekulasi terkait pembicaraan yang sudah berlangsung, terutama kepada Pak Daud. Misalnya tadi mengatakan bahwa kita mempunyai skeptisisme tertentu terhadap konsep dekolonial itu, tapi dalam konteks pemikiran Bapak sendiri, apakah ada model tertentu yang bisa kita gunakan, semacam pemikiran tandingan terhadap dekolonial dalam konteks masyarakat kita melihat perkembangan seni rupa kontemporer dan pewacanaan indigenous dalam konteks global, Pak? Mungkin Pak Daud bisa memberikan tanggapan terhadap pertanyaan saya.
Ya, langsung saya tanggapi, Mas.
Ya, silakan, Pak.
Ya, memang seperti yang saya katakan tadi, sebetulnya kan mungkin dekolonisasi itu dibutuhkan oleh negara-negara yang dulunya kolonial. Tetapi kita itu ya membutuhkan, artinya di sana menyadari bahwa ada hal-hal yang melemahkan mereka, artinya mereka ingin berbuat lebih baik gitu kan. Dan di sini juga mestinya menanggapi itu dengan meningkatkan, kita jangan merasa seperti kalau kemudian masih ya sebagai masih kita terlalu menggantungkan pemikiran pada mereka. Nah, saya yang khawatirkan tadi itu adalah ketika dekolonisasi itu tanpa pertimbangan yang cukup dalam begitu diterima begitu saja. Ini kan artinya sama dengan kita lagi-lagi akan mengambil gagasan-gagasan yang ada di mereka. Jadi kita mengimbangi dengan cara bagaimana kita itu lebih bebas. Makanya tadi saya mengatakan liberating ourselves, ya, our mind gitu, untuk tidak menerima begitu saja gagasan-gagasan yang dari sana. Jadi tidak hanya sekedar imitate begitu ya. Kalau di sana ada dekolonisasi yang sedang marak gitu ya. Nah, kemudian kita ikut-ikutan dengan konsep yang sama begitu. Ya. Misalnya saja ya, sebetulnya saya punya gagasan-gagasan ketika saya ditugaskan di museum UGM yang kecil gitu. Tapi saya ingin menggunakan media-media untuk pameran, ya, untuk menyampaikan itu tidak dengan video, tidak dengan display dan sebagainya, tetapi ya ada displaynya tentu saja. Tetapi dengan cara-cara bagaimana kita itu seringkali ya, meskipun ini juga di Barat sudah mulai banyak berkembang ya, storytelling, kemudian kalau di Jawa ada wayang beber, bahkan menggunakan media-media seperti kalau mereka menggunakan panel-panel, kita bisa menggunakan cermin, lukisan cermin itu ya misalnya. Nah itu kan media-media kita yang jarang ada. Nah, di situ kita mengangkat kita sendiri, gitu kan, menjadi bagian dari proses penampilan kita, ya. Itu adalah salah satu cara ya. Ini hanya yang praksisnya ya. Jadi kita tidak melihat lagi bahwa kalau di sana itu kemudian ada metode-metode game dan sebagainya, kemudian yang interaktif. Nah, ini berarti kita lagi kembali akan tergantung pada mereka, akan mengikuti teknologi mereka, gitu kan. Tapi bagaimana dengan teknologi kita? Ini kan semakin lama semakin hilang. Padahal kita ingin melestarikan apa yang menjadi budaya kita. Nah, bagaimana ini mengangkat dalam jalur yang lebih tinggi itu, ya, untuk menyajikan konsep-konsep yang mirip dengan museum misalnya, tapi dengan cara-cara yang kita sebetulnya punya. Masa kita tidak punya media? Gitu kan? Nah itu, maksud saya seperti itu. Jadi kita meningkatkan apa yang kita punya supaya juga mereka itu mau menghargai itu gitu. Ya, tidak hanya sekedar meniru ya teknologi baru mereka gitu. Ya, contohnya saja hanya itu sedikit gitu.
Oke,
terima kasih.
Your hand, maybe you can give a comment. Singkat saja, silakan Mele.
Sure. Yes, I would also kind of like to respond directly to your question, Mansur. I think that indeed there's one of the things that I want to respond to is the question of Pak Daud about do we really need decolonization? But I think that but Cosmin actually I think asked a more interesting question that indeed. I think we need it, but I think that we do not necessarily need this framework that comes from Europe. No, I think indeed we are already decolonizing in our own small little processes. And in fact, the problem. This is a question that I'm also constantly asking because, to a certain extent, I do have privilege as somebody from Southeast Asia who lives in Europe, as you know. Who has now getting access to this particular grants, funds that they are giving out for this topic. But surprisingly, there are still a lot of white colleagues who would still get it more than me. But indeed, the term is problematic in the sense that at the very center of the word is really colonialism, and therefore it's this huge ghost that we could not even unsee, because all we could ever do is put prefixes to it, whether it's pos or d, but at the very center is still this the coloniality, and therefore, indeed, I think one of the questions that we really need to ask are: can we? I think that methods and strategies are already operating. It's just a question of, can we find and talk about these without necessarily framing them within this very hegemonic term. And I think that is what is interesting indeed, because if it misses the radar of the empire, then it really is a decolonial method already, because it refused to speak that language, and therefore it is just operating as it is. And I think this is what makes it important. And maybe very quickly to the question of are there models? I think that there cannot be one model for this. I think that was the problem of the empire. It has developed a universalization idea, and this is what we should interrupt. that there is one universal method. And part of thinking about decoloniality is ensuring that we create the diversity, and therefore that the different strategies, that we allow for these different strategies to coexist side by side. And therefore it is important that it's a question here is, so decoloniality is not a what, I think. Decoloniality is a how and why. And and the answer is how. Our answer should be going in that direction, and all the whats would follow. In how, what do we put in the center, and part of that even is something that I have to learn very, very painfully, is that that coloniality and race and issues of gender are all also intertwined with issues of privileges, like who gets privileges to ensure to be able to speak, to be able to enact certain things, and when is the most powerful decolonial act is shutting up, and giving the floor to someone else, because this is not anymore your expertise. But at the same time, making sure that I could also interrupt a whitewashing colleague who might want to speak in behalf of Southeast Asia, but kind of like, wait, maybe it's not your turn. Maybe we need to give the floor to someone else. And, not to toot my own horn, I think that one of what I'm excited about for the next 3 years is that we've recently received the funding from the European Council to run a project called Decolonizing Southeast Asian Archives. So I'm working with sound archives and how to decolonize that. And to me, there are 3 keywords and 3 key operating methods here. My 3 keywords to completely decolonize is access, agency, and discourse. I think that at least from the perspective of Europe still tends to think that it is their duty to make all these looted materials from its former colonial countries should be made accessible. And to me, this is not even decolonizing. This is the basic work that needs to be done. All of these materials should just be simply accessible. But to decolonize, we need to move on, that as soon as these materials become accessible, how do we give the communities from which they come from the agency to shape the discourse about this? Because if the people who are constantly shaping the discourse, the ones who are publishing about it, the ones who are curating about these things, are not necessarily from that community, then we will never achieve this. And therefore, parts of what we're trying to do, for example, and I would really like to speak with Pak Daud at some point about this, we really want to, for example, we have the Jaap Kunst collection, the first Dutch ethnomusicologist who came to Indonesia and recorded different music cultures in the 1920s and the 1930s. We are now at the moment where we want to recurate it. We want to reassemble the collection. But one of the things we want to do through this funding is to invite colleagues from the Indonesian archipelago, and not just from Jakarta, but also from Nias, from Bali, where these recordings come from, to be the ones who would set the discourse about how should they be curated, rather than, again, they be done by another, by a diversity officer of the Netherlands. And so these are the steps that I'm currently excited about, and we managed to secure some funding to also allow fellowships to come over and to have this conversation, because sometimes we think that agency, for example, is somebody defined by a curator, a Dutch curator, but what we want to do is also this hacking, indeed, that we want to invite colleagues from Southeast Asia to come and access these museums, these archives, and then write a report and say, these are the problems, that we need to listen to who are these materials, who are these archives and museums for, and therefore we have to make sure that this accessibility and agency comes from those they are intended for, and therefore we want to collect these reports, these perspectives, so that we could ensure that this transpires, at least from the European perspective. And we are looking forward as well to do also work with Southeast Asian colleagues to repatriate some of these recordings, repatriate some of these materials, and think about how, indeed, what Pak Daud also importantly says is that we are also, we are also inheritors of this global culture. We are as much that that our entanglements with Europe makes us also inheritors of these civilizations. We could also shape and take this in the way that we would like it. It's not just the other way around, because that would maintain colonialism. It is a shared heritage that we have agency to shape in the way that we would have wanted it to be shaped into.
Ya, terima kasih pada Mele tanggapannya. Sayang sekali kita sudah berada di penghujung waktu dan tidak bisa membuka sesi pertanyaan dan kita harus mengakhiri diskusi ini. Sedikit untuk simpulan dari saya terkait dengan apa yang diperdebatkan tadi, bahwa jika dekolonial adalah sebuah bahasa atau konsep berpikir, kita harus menyadari bahwa ini bukan satu konsep tunggal, bahwa ada bayangan atau cita-cita tentang keragaman bahasa atau cara, yang mana dalam konteks itu yang menjadi penting bukanlah penggunaannya, tetapi proses bagaimana kita mempertanyakan kembali konsep-konsep yang kita gunakan sehingga kita bisa menemukan gaya ungkap tertentu yang kontekstual dan relevan bagi kebutuhan segala pihak. Sebelum kita mengakhiri diskusi ini, saya meminta kesediaan teman-teman semua untuk open video sehingga tim teknis bisa mendokumentasikan diskusi ini. Silakan kepada teman-teman untuk open video sejenak sebelum kita tutup. Ya, kepada tim teknis silakan untuk mengambil dokumentasi diskusi ini.
Okay, so please open your camera. I will start the countdown. 3, 2, 1, cheese. Okay, once more. 3, 2, 1, cheese. Oke, thank you.
Ya, terima kasih kepada tim teknis. Sekali lagi saya ucapkan terima kasih banyak kepada Pak Daud Tanudirjo, Kosmin Kostinas, dan Melaya Momo atas kesediaannya menjadi pembicara utama dan penanggap dalam diskusi ini. Sesi viral akan ada lagi bulan depan, tanggal pastinya belum ada, tapi kemungkinan besar tanggal 28 September. Semoga diskusi ini dapat memberikan inspirasi bagi kawan-kawan dalam memikirkan kembali praktik-praktik kita dalam konteks seni rupa kontemporer. Sekian dari saya dan terima kasih kami ucapkan kepada tim teknis panitia Biennale Forum. Sampai bertemu lagi, sampai jumpa.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kosmin. Thank you, Mele.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you for the translation. No, it was great. Thank you.
Thank you for the translation.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a good quarantine, Kosmin.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mele. Thank you, Pak Daud.